Down there, life continues. The traffic is awful, stocks go on trading, and Star Trek is still showing.
Good day, grade 8 learners. Welcome to today's Natural Sciences lesson. My name is Papucheto Singo, and this lesson is proudly brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education. In today's lesson, we're going to be learning under the knowledge area, life and living. The topic is microorganisms, and the subtopic, which is our main area of focus, is useful microorganisms. Now let's move on to today's lesson objectives, which are the goals that we want to achieve today. Now, here are the lesson objectives. So by the end of the lesson, you should be able to explain the essential roles of microorganisms and explain how microorganisms are used in food and medicine manufacturing and discuss different ways of food preservation. All this is sourced from your CAPS document on page 39. Right, let's move on to pre-knowledge. So this is what we've learned prior to today's lesson. In the 7th grade, you were introduced to classification of living organisms, the 5 kingdoms. And then in the 8th grade, so far, we've learned about types of microorganisms and harmful microorganisms. And all this we learned in our previous lesson. So we are concluding the topic today. So now let's move on to terminology. Let's move on to terminology. Right, what is the first term? The first term is fermentation. What is fermentation? Fermentation is the process of changing carbohydrates into alcohol and carbon dioxide. What are decomposers? These are organisms that decompose or break down organic material, including the remains of dead plant and animal material, usually bacteria and fungi. And what is an antibiotic? What is an antibiotic? This is a medicine used to treat diseases caused by bacteria. Next, on the terminology slide, what are legumes? What are legumes? These are groups of plants including beans, lentils, peas, and peanuts that have edible seeds inside fruit that forms a pod. And then preservation. Preservation, this is the activity or process of keeping something valued alive, intact, or free from decay. So that is what preservation is. And then penicillin. Penicillin, this is a common antibiotic. It is a common antibiotic, but that is used by doctors and nurses to treat various diseases all over the world. Now, let's talk about the use of microorganisms. Let's talk about the use of microorganisms. Where are microorganisms used and how are microorganisms used? So we already know that microorganisms are the small organisms that are too small for the eye to see. They perform various functions such as decomposing of dead organic material and assisting with the cycling of nutrients. And in addition to this, microorganisms are used by humans in various manufacturing processes and to make certain types of foods and medicines. Let's look at this picture here, or rather this short video of this fox. Remember when we were learning about feeding relationships? We learned that decomposers play a very important role, whether it is a food chain or a food web within the ecosystem. They break down dead organic material and recycle nutrients back into the ecosystem, mainly the soils, enriching the soils with fresh nutrients. So here is a dead animal, it's a dead fox. So what happens is decomposers, which are some of them are microorganisms, they help to break down the organic material and free the nutrients that are found within the fox, and returning or unlocking all that energy that is locked up within the fox's body and returning it into the ecosystem. When we talk about how humans use microorganisms. I'm sure maybe you have witnessed baking happening at home or steamed bread being made at home. So this makes use of microorganisms. So the microorganisms are used in the preparation of the bread. As you can see, the dough here is rising. The dough is rising, so it is used in the preparation. And then another use, this use is also used in nature. So besides breaking down the dead organic material, this is also in nature. We call these types of microorganisms nitrogen fixing legumes that are in plants. So in plants such as legumes, the roots actually contain what are called nodules. And inside of those nodules, it is a home, it is a habitat for certain bacteria. So certain bacteria are found inside the nodules of these plants. Now, the nitrogen fixing microbes are the bacteria that are found within the nodules of these microorganisms. So what is the relationship here, or what is the purpose of these nitrogen fixing bacteria? First of all, they are called rhizobia. They are called rhizobia, and unfortunately rhizobia are not able to live permanently on their own. So they require what is called a host. And who is this host? The host is the legume, the plant. That is the host. And what kind of symbiotic relationship is this called? If you remember from feeding relationship, this is mutualism. So what's the story behind the relationship between the legumes and the rhizobia? Now, so the rhizobia, which are nitrogen fixing bacteria, they supply nitrogen to the legumes. Remember, the legumes are your plants that are such as the pea plant, which are very rich in protein, so they require nitrogen for that. Now, so these bacteria supply nitrogen to the plant. And what does the plant do? In turn, the plant then supplies carbon to the bacteria. And the plant also supplies what? It supplies a home or shelter or a habitat. That's why we're saying this is mutualism, because both living organisms are benefiting from the relationship. The bacteria is benefiting carbon and it is benefiting a home. It's living in the nodules. And what is the legume, or what is the plant benefiting from the bacteria? The plant is also benefiting a supply of nitrogen, and none of the two are being harmed in the process. None of the two are being harmed in the process. So we also have bacteria that live inside of us. Yes, bacteria that live in animals, that live in mammals. And one particular bacteria that lives inside mammals is E. coli. If you remember from last week's lesson, we did learn about E. coli. And E. coli are naturally occurring gastrointestinal bacteria in the stomachs of most mammals, including us humans. So there is E. coli. If you remember from last week's lesson, when we're drawing different kinds and different shapes of bacteria, you remember the rod shaped bacteria, which is E. coli. Okay, so E. coli, how is it special and where do we find it? So E. coli is mainly found in the large intestine of warm-bodied animals. Now, they are part of the natural flora that is within the gut. They help the animal by producing an important vitamin called vitamin K2, and they also prevent harmful bacteria from growing in the gut. And what do they gain? They gain a habitat from living within the animal and also food. So here is another relationship that exists between a host and a microorganism that lives within that host. This is the relationship that exists between the two. Okay, now let's go back in time and learn about decomposers. If you remember, we did learn about decomposers in previous lessons. So now let's take a trip down memory lane. So back to our fox here that died in the forest, and then decomposers started breaking it down. And then we've got a fruit bowl there. It also was broken down by decomposers. And if you look at the end there, we've got new plant growth. So what is the importance of decomposers? So they help to keep the soil fertile. So this is very important. Remember, the soil needs to be fertile for the different living organisms that live inside of the soil and the plants that grow on the soil. Remember, the plants are the producers, so therefore they need good fertile soil. So the plants can use this for new growth. However, if there are no microorganisms, then dead plants and animals will not decompose. Can you imagine living in an environment where there are dead plants and animals all over the place and they are not breaking down? I'm sure it will be a very foul smelling place. So we do need these decomposers to break down dead organic material. We do need them quite a bit. Now, nutrients would not be released into the soil. So if there were no decomposers, which means no nutrients will not be released into the soil, which takes us back to this first point here. So which means we will not have any fertile soil. And if the soil is not fertile, then we won't have very good growth. And which means the soil would have become infertile, and we wouldn't want infertile soil. Now, microorganisms are also used by humans in this discipline called medicine. So they are also used in medicine. Yes, believe it or not, these living organisms are quite useful. They are very useful, hence the topic. They are very, very useful. Now, if you remember from last week's lesson, let's take a trip down memory lane. So Sir Alexander Fleming, which was one of the scientists we learned about last week, discovered the antibiotic substance called penicillin. How did he discover it? He discovered it by accident when he noticed that a bacterial culture had been contaminated with a fungus. So he had a bacterial culture in his petri dish that he was growing. So this was the bacterial culture, the one with the zigzag lines, and this is the fungus. So then he discovered that the fungus, and let's call it fungus F, had contaminated his culture in his petri dish. Then he further noticed something else. He saw that the bacteria that was surrounding the fungus, so if you look at the space around the fungus, that bacteria had been destroyed. Then he wondered to himself what could have happened. He realized that the fungus had produced a substance that killed the bacteria. It had produced a substance that killed the bacteria, and then this was when penicillin was discovered. So the fungus was producing this substance which is harmful to bacteria, and it changed the course of history of many incurable diseases that existed during that time, and these diseases were then cured with penicillin. So they continued growing the fungus so that they treat different ailments, or rather different ailments that are caused by bacteria, the different ailments that are caused by bacteria. Now, microorganisms are not only used in nature, they are also used in medicine, and they are also used to make food, which is very, very important. Now, humans have been using microorganisms to use food since the ancient times. So since before my time, since before your time, our parents' time, our grandparents' time, humans have been using microorganisms to prepare different kinds of food. Now, yeast has been used to make bread rice. So humans have been eating bread for many, many decades, and they used a microorganism called yeast to make the bread to rise, as well as brew wine and beer. So these microorganisms have been quite useful to our different cultures in the past centuries in the making of bread, in the making of beer, in the making of wine. So here is that picture. It's back again with the dough rising. I wonder what this person is making. Is it steamed bread? Now, there are certain types of bacteria that are used to make this very common delicacy, which is called yogurt and also cheese. So some cheese, however, it needs mold to grow. What is mold? Mold is a fungus, remember from last week. Now, mold will help them to become ripe or ripen and mature. So microorganisms are also very useful in the manufacturing of yogurt and cheese. Remember, there are different types of cheese there, and some of the different types of the cheese require mold in order for them to become ripe. Yogurt, here's a fun fact. Yogurt originated in the country called Turkey. So that's where they started making yogurt. So it originated from the country called Turkey. And how is it made? It is made by adding what is called a bacteria culture. So it's a culture or a mixture of bacteria. It is taken and then it is added to milk and allowed to ferment. So that is how that delicacy is prepared, by adding a bacterial culture to milk, and then it is allowed to ferment. And the partial digestion of the milk by this bacteria during fermentation makes the yogurt easy to digest when you and me then eat it. So that partial fermentation by the bacteria that would have been added to the yogurt will make it quite easy for it to be digested. It will make it quite easy for it to be digested. Now let's learn more fun facts of Welcome back, grade 8 learners. Sorry about that. We just had a technical glitch here in the studio. So now let's continue with using microorganisms to make food. So before, we've learned that microorganisms are used in bread making, wine brewing, and humans have been using microorganisms for centuries now. Now, bread, cheese, Yogurt, amasi, soy sauce, ginger beer, and beer, none of these foods and beverages would exist, or it would not be possible to make them without the help of microorganisms. So these living organisms are very vital to our diet as well. Okay, so here is a picture of some cheeses that are used making microorganisms. Now, people use microorganisms such as yeast and bacteria for baking bread, brewing beer, and the culturing of milk. As we discussed, that when we make yogurt, we need bacteria in order to make the yogurt, and the microorganism that carries out the process of fermentation. So all this during the brewing of beer or during the culturing of milk, we call this process fermentation, and it is the microorganism that carries out the process. How does it do it? It does it through the process of fermentation. So what really happens during fermentation? So the carbohydrates that will be between the substance at the beginning or the reactants will be changed into acids or alcohols and carbon dioxide. So remember, when we're learning about photosynthesis, we learned about something called a chemical reaction. So fermentation is also a chemical reaction that is done or activated by microorganisms, that is taken care of by microorganisms. Now let's move on to our first activity. Number one, how are microorganisms used in nature and in industry, and who discovered penicillin and how was it discovered? I'm going to give you 3 minutes to answer these questions. Then after 3 minutes, we will do the solutions together. So see you after 3 minutes. Don't forget to send in your responses or any questions you may have to the WhatsApp number at the bottom of the screen. See you after 3 minutes. Welcome back, grade 8. Now let's answer these questions together. The first question was, how are microorganisms used in nature and in industry? They perform various functions such as decomposing dead or organic material, so they work as decomposers. They decompose dead and organic material and return nutrients back into the soil, making the soil fertile for the benefit of other living organisms that exist within the ecosystem. They are also used by humans in various manufacturing processes, for example, make certain types of food and medicine. Right, take 1 minute to quickly copy down this answer and then we'll move on to the next slide for the second solution. Welcome back. Let's move on to question number 2. Who discovered penicillin and how was it discovered? So if you notice, this is a two-part question. You needed to tell us who discovered penicillin and then tell us how they discovered penicillin, hence the 4 marks. So you need to tell us who discovered it and how it was discovered. So who was it? It was Sir Alexander Fleming. He discovered penicillin and it was discovered actually by accident. He noticed that a bacterial culture that had been contaminated with a fungus, and he saw that the bacteria that were close to the fungus immediately surrounding the fungus had all been destroyed, and he realized that the fungus was producing a substance that killed the bacteria. Okay, I'll give you another minute to quickly copy down this answer. Welcome back, grade 8. Let's move on to preservation of food. If you remember from our terminology slide, we learned about the preservation of food, helping food not to get bad or to decay. So how has it been done over the years? So more microorganisms are everywhere. They are everywhere, so food materials can easily become contaminated with them. And still, food sometimes gives a foul smell, taste bad, and can potentially make us ill. So we need to preserve our food and prevent it from getting decayed so that it doesn't smell bad, taste bad, and make us ill. So what are the different methods of preservation that have been discovered or have been used over the past centuries. So let's start off with the first one. The first one is called drying or dehydration, getting most of the water out of the food. So many foods are dried in the sun to prevent spoilage by microorganisms. A very popular food that is prepared by drying is biltong. So it is a process that uses the sun. So in the homes there, our grandmothers and grandfathers used to use the sun to dry meat so that it did not decay, and hence biltong was born. Here is another method of preservation of food, which is using salt and sugar. Salt and sugar are actually very good preservatives as they do not allow organisms to grow. So they don't give organisms an environment for them to grow. So some microorganisms actually make the food to decay. So they are always used in the preparation of jam, jelly, or pickles. So jam is essentially made from fruits. So lots of sugar is mixed with fruits and then they are boiled for a long time to make jam. And this is another way to preserve fruits. So jam is actually preserved fruits that where they use salt. So with pickles, they use salt to use different kinds to make different kinds of pickles. So using salt and sugar is actually a very good way to preserve fruit. Okay. And the next method of preservation is refrigeration. So refrigeration is when is a refrigerator rather it's a device that uses low temperatures. It uses low temperatures to keep its food from decaying. Microorganisms' growth is slowed down or it is retarded by low temperature. So keeping your food in the refrigerator will help your food from decaying. It will help your food from going bad. So that's why most people do keep their food in the refrigerator, but that doesn't mean that it lasts forever. It's not going to rot. It just slows down the growth of microorganisms. If you want your food to stay longer, you can do what is called freezing. So that's why most of the time the refrigerator is in two parts. There's the chilling part where people normally put their vegetables and fruits, and then there's a part where the food is frozen where people normally put their meats. So refrigeration and freezing, these are very good methods of food preservation as they slow down the growth of microorganisms and help our food to stay fresh for longer periods of time. And then method number 4 of food preservation is what is called pasteurization. Pasteurization. Milk, as we all know, fresh milk. If you've visited the villages and you've had fresh milk from the cow or from the goat, it easily gets contaminated by microorganisms. And once it gets contaminated by microorganisms, it tends to curdle and turns sour. It becomes amasi. Right, so to prevent that from happening, what happens in industry is that food is heated to a very high temperature, which is 70 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes. So it's heated for 70 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes. What does this do? It kills the microorganisms that may have contaminated the milk and may cause it to become sour. So for 10 minutes, the milk is heated at a temperature of 70 degrees Celsius, and then it is quickly cooled off at a temperature of 10 degrees Celsius. Alright, so this will then help the milk to last longer. That's why we have milk that is sold in the shelves of supermarkets and not in the refrigerator. Even if you take that box home, you can keep it at home for quite a lengthy period of time. It is not going to be bad. But once you open that milk carton, you need to finish it within a few days. And then method number 5. Method number 5 is sterilization. sterilization. So what happens during sterilization? So food products are heated at very high temperatures, and then the food is stored in airtight containers, which are food cans. I'm sure you've seen food cans now. They have fruits, they have beans, they have meat in the tin cans, they also have corn, and they also have fish. So we've got different types of vegetables and meats that can be preserved using this method of sterilization, where that food is heated at very high temperatures and then stored in an airtight container such as a can. So this is where canned food arises from. It is a method of preserving food. Now, how do the high temperatures contribute to the preservation of the food? The high temperatures kill the microorganisms that normally make the food to decay or to become bad. So the high temperatures kill the food, and once the high temperatures kill the microorganisms, and once the microorganisms have been killed, that food is then put in airtight containers. Airtight containers such as canned food do not allow anything to go inside of the can, so the food is preserved. So the food becomes preserved. And then method number 6 of food sterilization. Method number 6 is the use of what are called chemical preservatives. What are called chemical preservatives? What are these chemicals? Such chemicals such as vinegar. I'm sure you've seen vinegar at home, sodium benzoate, and sodium metabisulfite are commonly used to preserve food materials. So how are they used to preserve food materials? So they are added onto the food, usually a jar or sauce and squashes. So they are added into the food to preserve. So there is a picture of some food that is in a jar where chemicals have been added to it. So these chemicals, they prevent the growth of microorganisms. So them preventing the growth of microorganisms means the food is going to last longer. The food is going to last a bit longer. So these are the 6 ways of preserving food. You can either dry it or dehydrate it. In the olden days, they used the sun to dry the food. Adding sugar or salt, this is in the manufacturing of jam and pickles. Chilling or refrigerating, this is where food is put in a refrigerator under a low temperatures so that the food to retard or to slow down the growth of microorganisms using of chemical preservatives. So adding chemical preservatives to the food. Or sterilization, this is heating food to very high temperatures and then putting it in airtight containers so that no bacteria get into the containers and to kill the bacteria in the high temperatures. Or pasteurization. So with pasteurization, what normally happens is milk is heated to 70 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes, then quickly cooled to 10 degrees Celsius for another 10 minutes. This helps in killing microorganisms that would have contaminated the milk in the process of collecting it. Now, which brings us to our second activity. Question 1. Name 3 foods that are made using microorganisms for 3 marks, and give 3 methods of food preservation and describe how the food is preserved in each method for 6 marks. So I'm going to give you 4 minutes to do this activity. Then after 4 minutes, we will go through the solutions together. Don't forget to send in your solutions and any questions you may have to 079 578 2908. So see you after 4 minutes. Welcome back, grade 8 learners. Let's answer the questions together. So we're supposed to name 3 foods that are made using microorganisms. So we've got beer, cheese, bread, wine, soy sauce, and yogurt. So you can choose any of these. You can choose any of these. Just pick 3. So there are many foods that are made using microorganisms. Microorganisms are very, very useful to us. Then the second question was a bit longer. It required us to give one, 3 methods of food preservation. So you need to give 3 methods of food preservation and describe how the food is preserved in each method. So you give the method and then you give how the food is preserved using that particular method. So we'll start off with drying and dehydration. How is food preserved using this method? Drying food in the sun to prevent spoilage by microorganisms. So the actual drying or dehydration, removal of any moisture within the food. And then another method which you could have picked was using sugar and salt. So adding sugar and salt to the food to preserve it. This is another way of preserving food. And then 3, refrigeration. Refrigeration. This is keeping food in the fridge to prevent the growth of microorganisms. This is another way. So these are not the only methods. We've got more. So if you chose any 3 from these 6. Another method of food preservation is preventing, preserving milk by heating it to 70 degrees Celsius and then cooling it to 10 degrees Celsius. And then sterilization is heating food products at very high temperatures, and then food is stored inside airtight containers. It could be a can. It could be a can. And then the last one is using chemical preservatives, using sodium benzoate, vinegar, and sodium metabisulfate to preserve food materials. Take 1 minute to quickly copy down these corrections and then we will wrap up our lesson. Welcome back. Now let's wrap up our lesson. Today we learned quite a lot about useful microorganisms and different ways to prevent food from spoiling. So this is what we went through today. So some microorganisms play very important roles. They play essential roles in ecosystems. We know that both the biotic and abiotic factors of an ecosystem play important roles, and which is decomposing of the plant and animal matter, so thereby recycling nutrients back into the soil. What does this help with the soil? It helps the soil to become very fertile. It helps the soil to become fertile. So microorganisms play essential roles in this. And some microorganisms are used by people to make certain foods and medicines. So what kind of foods are made from using microorganisms? We gave examples such as bread, brewing beer, brewing wines, making cheese. We even said soy sauce as well. So making these different kinds of foods, so using microorganisms. We also learned that microorganisms are also take part in different symbiotic relationships within ecosystems. We learned about the special plants called the legumes and the relationship that microorganisms have. The relationships that microorganisms have with legumes is that microorganisms stay or live within the nodules of legumes. What do? They supply nitrogen to the legumes, which the legumes need in their food production. What else do? They also supply the plant. They also supply the plant with carbon, and the plant. What does the plant do in turn? The plant supplies the microorganism with the habitat because they cannot survive on their own on the outside. So this, we said, this is some type of symbiotic relationship, and we said this is mutualism. We also learned about this microorganism called E. coli that is found within the gut of different warm-blooded animals. We said E. coli helps in the production of a special vitamin. The special vitamin is called vitamin K2, and they also help in making sure that other microorganisms do not contaminate or infect the large intestine. And what do they benefit from the host? They benefit getting a habitat and food as well. So microorganisms are found all over. They are found in nature. They are used by legumes and mammals in symbiotic relationships, and they are also used in industry by humans to manufacture different foods, bread, beer, wine, cheese, and soy sauce. Microorganisms are also used in the manufacture of medicines. We learned about a special medicine called penicillin. Right. So this medicine is called an antibiotic. Who discovered it? It was discovered by Sir Alexander Fleming. Well, he discovered it actually by accident. He discovered it by accident when he had a bacterial culture which was contaminated by a fungus. Then he noticed that the bacteria that was near the fungus had all been destroyed, meaning that the fungus was producing a substance which destroyed bacteria. So this then led to a breakthrough in medicine, helping to cure diseases that had inflicted communities over the years. So this was due to the discovery of penicillin. So other medication or other medicines have been discovered since then, and we call these antibiotics, and they are used to treat diseases which are caused by bacteria. Right, let me clear the board here. Okay, so now let's move on to the second part of our lesson, which was methods of food preservation. So we learned that microorganisms are everywhere. They are on your table surfaces, they are on doorknobs, they are everywhere. And these microorganisms can be detrimental to our health as well as our food. So humans over the centuries have designed different methods to preserve their food and prevent their food from decaying, because decaying food smells bad. Decaying food tastes bad, and decaying food can make you ill. So what are the different methods of food preservations that we learned? We learned about the making of jams. How are jams made? Jams are made by adding sugar to different foods, and this is a very good way of preserving food. We know that jams are made from fruits, so this is one way of preserving fruit. And then we learned about food preservation using salt. So some cultures use salt to preserve their food and keep their food from going bad or rotting. Another way is canning. We call this sterilization. This is when food is heated to very high temperatures, and during this heating process, microorganisms are killed. So once the food is heated in these high temperatures and any microorganisms that could be on the food is killed, then what's the next step? The next step is putting this food in a sealed container or an airtight container. So this airtight container will prevent any microorganisms from getting into the food and decaying the food. We also learned about freezing and chilling. This is when food is put in a refrigerator. So we know refrigerators, the one part of the refrigerator chills and the other part of the refrigerator freezes. So what the refrigerator does, it keeps food at very low temperatures below 4 degrees Celsius. So that temperature discourages the growth of bacteria, or it slows down the growth of bacteria. So with time, you can have your fruits for a week in the fridge or for a couple of days. It can be stored in the refrigerator. And then if you want your food to last in the refrigerator for 3 months or longer, you can then keep it in the freeze. You can freeze it. People usually freeze meat and they chill their vegetables. So this is another way of preventing food from spoiling in a short space of time. Another way of preserving food is drying or dehydrating. So you dry different kinds of food. I gave the example of biltong, where meat is dried with salts and spices to create the delicacy called biltong. But there are other foodstuffs that can be dried, especially the grains, your maize grain, your wheat grain, your sorghum. They can also be dried. You can also dry vegetables as well if you want to eat them later. So drying is another good way, or dehydrating is another good way of food preservation. And then we learned about pasteurization, discovered by Louis Pasteur. So pasteurization is a method that is mainly used in the preservation of milk. So milk is often contaminated by microorganisms. These microorganisms causes the food to curdle. It causes the milk to become sour. So this method called pasteurization helps to eliminate any microorganisms that would have contaminated the milk. How is the process done? So what happens is the milk is heated to a temperature of 70 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes. After that, it is quickly cooled down to 10 degrees Celsius. So this space of time and that particular temperature is sufficient enough to kill any microorganisms that would have contaminated the milk and decayed the milk. So this is a very good way of food preservation. It is a very good way of food preservation. And then which brings us to chemicals, which brings us to adding chemicals to food. So different chemicals that have been added to food over the years are vinegar, sodium benzoate, and sodium metabisulfite. So these chemicals are used in the preservation of food. So next time you go to the supermarket, or if there's any food in the house, just read the labels or read the preservatives that have been used to preserve that particular food. It could be a beverage, or it could be solid food, it could be grains or meat. Just look at the label and see how the food has been preserved. So chemicals are often used to preserve food, which is another great method that has been developed by human beings over time in order to preserve our food, keep our food from spoiling. All right, okay, grade 8 learners. Thank you so much for joining me in today's lesson. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed it, and all the best with your exams. Bye-bye.